Hello, hello, and welcome to yet another David Messiah YouTube presentation. My name is Sidney Thomas. I'm the founder and moderator of this YouTube channel, where our watchwords are to teach and to build back up the kingdom of Zion. The title of today's presentation is China in Prophecy. China in Prophecy. And this is an interesting subject because China seems to be a bit of a conundrum. Why do I say that? In at least two recent presentations, one is the one about Russia being the king of the South. Well, if Russia is the king of the South and the US NATO is the king of the North, where does China fit in? And that question arises because of a second recent video on Gog and Magog defined, where it is we see that the King of the North, in terms of its US NATO force projection, is essentially um, a creature, if you like, of that which scripture calls Gog and Magog. So, and Russia, we find out when we go deep into it in its original sort of ethnic formation and identity, the Rus people that founded that land, they are not Gog and Magog, and we can therefore see why Russia could indeed be a candidate for being the king of the South, because in some sense it is being not Gog and Magog, it could be simply opposed to it, and vice versa. Gog and Magog are somehow intrinsically opposed to Russia, which is a case I was making. But what about China? China, Gog and Magog? That becomes the question. And if they are Gog and Magog, how come they're not part of that King of the North in the US NATO force projection? So that conundrum needs to be addressed, and indeed we do address it. The guts of the contribution is to be found in an audio lecture in the manner that I've been following. So I give a link to that audio lecture, which is about 2 hours long. It is a lecture. It's more a lecture than a talk, because to address the question of China in prophecy, it is necessary to really go back to the beginning. And it is in going back to the beginning that we can begin to have the means to answer this conundrum that now sort of puts itself forward, that confronts us in the face, so to say. And in going back to the beginning, what we find, and I give here only a synopsis, the full lecture, of course, is to be found in that 2 hour audio presentation, to which a link is provided in the description box. The sort of summary of it is that the original Aboriginal people of the land now called China would have been Negro Israelites. And there is prophetic basis for that in 2nd Ezra chapter 13, verse 41, that after the Assyrian invasion and captivity, the northern tribes were scattered out, and part of that scattering resulted in them being scattered out to places where never before mankind dwelt. And that includes far North America at the time. It includes far Western and Northwestern Europe at the time. It includes those places within Africa that Ham had not inhabited. It includes the Far East, which would then be China, and other places further east, Japan, Korea, and etc. And it included the far South Pacific. So that's the sort of foundational scriptural basis for that assertion. But we also find archaeological evidence to that effect in the case of China. We know that the founding or the first dynasty of China, the Shang dynasty, still today, that Emperor Shang is depicted as a Negro, as a very dark-skinned Negro, and he brought them herbology and various other things like that. Um, the archaeological evidence is sort of compounded further with a kind of a linguistic evidence, because even the name Shang can be seen to be a Hebrew word, Shah Nega, or Nega Shah. And we've addressed the question of the word nega and how it arises in the Paleo Hebrew, because it is Hebrew word H5065, if memory properly serves. So it is nega with a prefix or suffix sha. And in the modern Hebrew, they say that word means tyrant. So nega is a king, and Shah is depicted in the Paleo Hebrew by sharp teeth. So we see there the sense of that king that has especially sharp teeth. In other words, a very powerful and mighty king. You don't mess with. And we see that also in the Yoruba tradition, where there's a deity called Shango, who was really a deified ancestor. And he was known as a very powerful and mighty king. And after his death was sort of deified in the way that King Saul, when he went to the what should we call her, the witch at Endor, sought to raise up Samuel from the dead, because he was known as a very powerful and wise man, and Saul was no longer being answered by spirit, either by dream or by prophet or by Urim. So he called on the deceased Saul to try to get some answers, and he used that seeress called the witch at Endor to Samuel. Well, the Yoruba people do the same with that mighty King Shango. So, it's an old practice that goes back a long, long way to our House of David ancestors, of deifying our mighty ancestors. That's the whole point of the word Orisha, which is kind of, its literal meaning is a select head. I won't go too much into that in this short transmittal video. But what I'm saying is that the original people of China were Negro, and therefore they would have been dark of skin, as are the Negro today. But the Chinese people today are certainly not, in general, dark of skin. And so we need to ask, well, okay, what changed? And what we get, there were obviously, and this is known, that wherever the Negro went, the forces of Edom, his enemies, Edom and Ishmael and Moab and Ammon and all the others allied with Edom in that regard, were sure to follow. Whether it took a generation or several generations, they were sure to follow. And with that comes a whitening process. And how does the whitening come about? It comes about through Gog and Magog, which in that presentation recently uploaded, we see that Gog is a name now rendered as Gog, but which in the ancient Paleo Hebrew was Egyogo, and he was a Nephilim. He was a fallen angel. He came down to earth and sired that titular son of Japheth, who was named Magog. And if I say he was Omogog, the Yoruba people who are listening would understand clearly. But really, because we use the term Omo as a prefix and sometimes as a suffix to indicate child of. And generally we understand it in the spiritual sense, but it also applies in the physical sense. So in the name that was given to that titular son of Japheth that was named Magog is the clue that indeed he was the son of that fallen angel, that Nephilim. And we know about the Nephilim because it's there in the book of Enoch, chapter 6. It's there in Genesis also, chapter 6, verses 4 and 5. Those are the watchers that came down from heaven and took for themselves wives, all whom they chose. It's there in the book of Jude, chapter 1, verse 6. And it is there also in the book of Enoch, chapter 106, which is where we get the piece of information that when Noah was born and came out basically an albino, pale-skinned, his father was afraid that perhaps the boy was not his. And he thought rather that he must have been the son of a fallen angel. So that's how we know we could draw this connection of pale skin as a feature likely to occur. Scripture doesn't say it always occurs, but clearly likely to occur when a Nephilim mates with a human female and produces offspring. And this also illuminates the book of Genesis, where the story of Cain and Abel is spoken of. And a mark was put upon Cain. And that mark put upon Cain was that mark of pale skin. And this is partly how we know that Cain indeed was the first offspring of a fallen angel. All right, one may argue that, but don't argue Enoch 106, don't argue Enoch chapter 6, don't argue Genesis chapter 6, don't argue Jude verse 6, that Nephilim presence was there. And also in Enoch chapter 106, he let us to know that after the flood, because Enoch in 106 had prophesied that Noah was there for a particular purpose and would live through the flood with his sons. And that the flood was brought about because those offspring of the Nephilim, of the fallen angels, were thinking only evil continually. And they were not supposed to have come down here to earth in the first place. That's there in Genesis chapter 6, verse 5. Okay, so there's a pale skin connection then to the isles, those who populated the isles of the Gentiles. And in that upload on Gog and Magog defined, we see where the word Gentile comes from, which was just two Paleo-Hebrew letters, Gia and Nun, the son of the wicked one. The wicked one being any one of those Nephilim, because it is those who followed Lucifer in his rebellion in heaven who would have been the ones that would have come down to mate with human females. And before the flood, it was Semyaza and his 200 confederates and their particular pact that's talked about there in Enoch chapter 6. After the flood, it was this angel named Egyogo, whose name is given by three Paleo-Hebrew letters. It was Gya, Ga, He. And I, using Urim, Ituhum, I was guided that the full vocalization was Egyogo. And that vocalization is what was changed in two ways in the scripture that has come down to us in the English. One way was to have it sort of morph into the name Gog, and the other way was to have it morph into the word Goy. But either way, it did trace back to that Egyogo, that fallen angel, that Nephilim. How does that relate to China? China in prophecy is that although China would have been populated first by Negroes who would have founded that first dynasty, and so we would have seen that Negro kind of trait infusion coming down the generations, down even to the very last emperor, Puyi, one could see a kind of a Negro phenotypic presence in his look. But hard on the heels of that original Negro presence would have been an expanding Gentile presence arising out of those sons of Japhet, one of whom was that Magog. And from that Magog, you had the Magog, or the house, the whole house of Magog and all of his descendants, plus those allied with him. So that the sort of Nephilim infiltration that occurred with Magog, and there's no reason to suppose that it was limited to Magog, we find this sort of pale skin presence now becoming a feature of those who inhabited the Isles of the Gentiles, regardless of who their original patriarch was, because Japheth had many sons. And what I'm guided is that in the case of China, the sort of original patriarchal root of the people that then moved to China, in large part, because it was not only one seed line, in large part it was that particular son of Japheth named Tubal. But others also came. And in addition to those, we find in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 25, that Moab was to be sent as a curse, actually, over to those people that were there in the Far East, which is where now China is. So there's a big Moabite presence among the Chinese. So there's an original Negro presence. There is a Gentile presence coming down from those of Japhet, and essentially, therefore, the Amagog, okay, tracing back not so much to Magog himself, but to one Tubal, but also others of Gentile Amagog origin who would have peopled that land. We also find in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 25, verse 4, that the children of Ammon would also people, be sent off to people various parts of the Far East. Well, they became a major seed line amongst the Mongolians, amongst the Japanese, amongst the Koreans, as Moab became a major seed line among the Chinese. So all of that, in terms of China in prophecy, I'm trying to answer that question, but going back to the beginning. But what it is leading up to in terms of where we are in the present is that in large part, China is now essentially of category Gog and Magog. And so the question now arises, which I stated at the outset, how come then they are allied, not with the King of the North, U.S. NATO force projection, but rather allied with if anything, the king of the south, which is Russia. So that little conundrum is addressed in the talk, and I commend it to you. But just to give you the resolution in brief, well, there's one essential aspect of it, which is there in prophecy, is there in Revelation chapter 17, verse 10, which speaks of the 7 heads and the 10 horns, by which that red dragon could be characterized. And riding that red dragon was that whore, WHORE, Mystery Babylon, which in the last presentation on Gog and Magog defined, we could identify as being as a homonym, the HOR, the House of Rothschild. And scripture also lets us to know that those 7 heads and 10 horns would hate the whore. So that even though, in a sense, they all part of the same beast, there is dissension among them. And at Revelation 17:10, it speaks of at a certain point in time when it could be said that 5 of those are fallen. In other words, their time has come and gone, essentially. Are not quite gone, but they have come and they're no longer the preeminent head. And then there's one that is, and then there's one that is to come. And when he does come, he will continue for only a short space. Well, that is a reference to China. China is the one that is to come, and when he does come, it will continue only a short space. The one that is the United States and that UK, US, NATO formation. So US is now in decline. China is seeing itself as a successor to that hegemon who is US that is now in decline. And even though China, communist China under Chairman Mao, was financed by that whore, he hates the whore. And he is doing something similar to what we saw in the case of President Putin when the Soviet Empire collapsed, and first the oligarchs were basically picking that carcass clean. And then he came in, and like one of the ancient czars, he sought to do for Russia what was to the benefit of Russia and not have it be picked apart by the whore or those of his persuasion allied with him and working for him. So that the whore is now basically riding that US, UK, NATO formation to force project, and is still trying to sort of kneecap Russia. This is what that was about. While China, although financed by the whore, it's like if you have a money lender, but you pay back the money lender. He has no cause really to kneecap you, but the whore wants to keep all his 7 heads and 10 horns in line. And after you pay back the moneylender, you might hate the moneylender. You don't want him coming near again. So the Chinese Communist Party, that dictatorship that now rules China, number one, they are anti they're anti-Har Armageddon. So in that sense, they are very much Gog and Magog. Remember now, the Har Armageddon, which is the Paleo-Hebrew way of referencing what Scripture calls in the English today Armageddon. And there's a war of Armageddon. Well, that war of Armageddon is a war against the rise of the Negro. Because this is the essential underlying dynamic is the bringing down of Babylon order and the raising back up of Zion order. And Zion order represents the horn, the power, the rebirth, if you like, or the rise again of Negro power in the world. Because Amagededi is a reference to the Negro. Literally, it means the tribal collective of the Gededi people. The Gededi people is the watched over David people. Dedi is just another way of representing David. And the Gadedi is in the Paleo Hebrew, that letter Ga is represented by an I. So David was always the watched over one, the one who was the apple of God's eye. So when you say Gededi, it's a reference to the people of Nega David. So it has the exact same reference as the word Negro. Negro literally means the root of Nega David. But David is left implied, the root of the Nega. And the root of the Nega is that tribal collective known as the Bayuda, Judah, the Lion of Judah. So whether you say Negro or you say Gededi or Amagededi, the referent is to Bayuda, the tribal root of Nega David. And by the way, the word Druid also has exactly the same reference, because Druid is again Dedi. In Paleo Hebrew, it's Dal, Resh, Dal. So it's like taking the word for David, which is Deod. It wasn't actually David, it was Deod. And the sort of evidence for that is that in the Arabic they still say Dawood, not Davud or David. So, but in the Hebrew it was Deod, kind of a diphthongal kind of representation. And when you put a resh in between there to make it Deruid, which becomes Druid, you're saying the root of David. And the root of David, again, is that tribal root, which is the Bayuda, okay, the Negro. So Druid literally means Negro. Amagededi literally means Negro. And of course, Negro means the root of the Nega, the tribal root. Who are his people? This is in the sort of Paleo Hebrew language. We say David was of the root of Jesse, meaning he came from Jesse. And Jesse is of the root of Judah, the fourth son of Jacob. You can also take it back up to Jacob and say, well, okay, nigga, David was of the root of Jacob, as an all Israelite. But because of the separation between the northern tribes and the southern tribes, when you say the root of the Nega, root of Nega David, the more narrow and specific reference is to the house of Judah. So where am I going with this? China is very much being Amagog, Gog and Magog, is also engaged in that denigration project, the whitening project. So they don't want to sort of admit even that their origins are in a Negro origin. And even the the Moabite part of them would be sort of a Negro part or dark-skinned part. It is the Gog and Magog part that introduces the paleness of skin. So when Chairman Mao came in and the Communist Chinese essentially took over from the last emperor, who was Puyi, One of the things they did, which is familiar to us now, in terms of denigration, one of Chairman Mao's sort of schemes was to get rid of everything old. You know, it's like when the Europeans got to Egypt and they didn't like the look of these pharaohs and so forth, so they used cannon fire to blast off those noses which looked too negroid. Well, the Communist Party in China did the same thing. So they tried to get rid of what they call the four olds. And that's gone into in the talk. I'm not going to repeat it here. So this is how the conundrum is explained. China is still very much anti Gidedi. So in terms of the War of Armageddon, they line up with the Gog and Magog. But in terms of them now trying to take over from the existing hegemon, who is the United States, they hate the whore and they want now to sort of raise themselves up to replace the existing hegemon and to become a new hegemon. And when, of course, they do that, then they might or might not have a beef with Russia. Because, you know, Chairman Mao and the Russians did have a little shooting war after the Communist Chinese came in, but that's old history. I won't even go into that. It doesn't illuminate the main subject at issue, which is China in prophecy and how it is they're lining up both against that US UK NATO formation and at the same time they are very much against the rise of the whore, the HOR whore, the horn of the Armageddon, the horn of the Negro power. But scripture is clear in Revelation 17, verse 10, that when he comes, China that is, he will continue only a short space. And there's some further prophecy that addresses that whole question, where we see that it has to be a Chinese kind of military formation that would indeed bring about some serious destruction upon the planet, where 1/3 of the people, which is about 2 billion people, would perish as a result of that. So with that, I won't say any more. That's a sort of broad lay of the land in terms of what is discussed at some length, 2 hour length in the audio, and I call it a lecture more so than a talk because it develops itself in that kind of a fashion. So I commend it to you. It has been a joy for me to prepare it and to bring it to you in line with the watchwords of this channel, to teach and to build back up Zion. And so with that, I say, well, first of all praises, all glory, all exaltation, all thanks be unto the Most High, and to all those who may be still listening, shall we?